All right, so at this point, this car has driven its last mile. I replaced the transmission seal a couple of months ago. I was able to drive it a couple of times, but it started leaking again, which indicates there's internal damage that's beyond anything that could be done without it being replaced. Okay, so not only that, if I was to get the transmission replaced, even if I was to replace it myself, which I could do, right? I have the environment to do it, but it's just really not reasonable with the amount of resources that I've already put into this vehicle. Okay, so at this point, it's pretty much a done deal. And to number and name the issues, the battery started smoking in my more recent uploads. It was smoking, and the reason being is because I had the charger to it while I had the alternator running, and wasn't paying attention, and it started smoking. And from my gatherings indicates that the battery is going bad. I got this used. It was already a year and so in. All right, so it's a little over 3 years now at this point, so it's kind of expected, but it was showing signs of failure because I had to pretty much charge it every other day. All right, got an oil leak over here. The valve cover gasket, I assume, is the culprit, which isn't a problem, but for this, I would take the bracket off because on the Series 2, you don't have to worry about that. It's much easier. See the solder setup I got with the intermittent no start? That was a whole series that took me months to figure out, and it actually started kind of failing out again in November. I ended up recently zip tying this because it had went out. So again, it's just a lot of stuff going on with this. The radiator hose going to the radiator from the engine block, that's leaking as well, which this isn't an issue, right? But just to name the numbers of problems. We got the rust building up really bad. We got issues with the inner tie rod and boot. And there is a metal connector that goes between the boots that fell out. I couldn't seem to get it back in. I'm starting to get annoyed at this custom downpipe weld that I put on for the middle resonator instead of the catalytic converter. Actually, the catalytic converter, one of the pieces that was holding the rubber to hold the catalytic converter, rusted off and fell off. So I couldn't even put the stock back on if I wanted to. Or I could, but it would be much more complex. And to name the least of issues to occur after I replace the transmission, I've already done quite a number of operations on this car. I replaced the fuel pump twice. I replaced the actual fuel tank twice. I dropped it 3 times. I did an undercoat, and that's starting to fail. Of course, you got to continue to do that. Yeah, for the catalytic converter, there's the 2, but there's one down there that broke off. And again, it's just a lot going on here. The vapor vent canister solenoid continues to leak even though I've replaced it. So that would be another issue. I have a cracked windshield nonetheless. I continue to get flats back here. I've already fixed this tire twice. Okay. So with that being presented, it doesn't make sense to put any more energy into this vehicle. If it was no other issues and it was just the transmission, of course I would have done it. But if the transmission being fine, I got windshield, I got just so many other problems. There's a couple of other things I didn't even name, and it just doesn't make sense. I could take the expertise from these experiences and implement them into the new vehicle without the overhang worry of something going wrong at any given point in time. All right. But I was just so combative with, getting rid of the vehicle because the 3800 Series 3 engine, or the 3800 series in general, is one of the best engines that GM has ever made, and it's very reliable, right? And with the previous vehicle, the previous Buick I had, I went ahead and got the transmission replaced for that very reason, but there was an accident that was beyond my control, so there goes that. And here it is now, the transmission went out, and that's beyond my control. Now, what my assumption is what happened is when the timing cover gasket failed and I replaced it, there was a period of time that I drove and there was not enough coolant going through the engine, therefore not going through the coolant lines going through the transmission. I think the transmission overheated, but I wasn't driving it long enough for me to really see the result until later, because what happens is there's a seal. So In my recent uploads, I did the seal on the timing cover that goes around the crankshaft. But what the seal basically does is, for whatever lubricant, it's the same for the timing cover, and it's the same on the transmission where the CVT goes. So I replaced the transmission seal, but if there's any damage inside, as that lubrication is going through the transmission, it's going to start to pull up on that seal, and it's going to overspill, right, because of metal shards. And I think that's pretty much what occurred as to why I'm seeing these leaks all of a sudden. But I was driving fine, and then all of a sudden the things are getting rough intermittently. Okay, so that's pretty much the verdict on that. But with the mileage, normally from my gatherings, the 3800 Series 3 timing cover gasket starts to fail anywhere between 150 and 180,000 miles. And I got it to 184,000. So I was outside that outlier, but then the transmission for the 4T65Es, they're not known to be reliable. Okay, great engine. With my setup, but the transmission is questionable. And if I recall it, for the previous Buick I had, the transmission went out at 196,000 miles. And that actually accelerated because I did a flush. And during that time, I wasn't aware that if you go beyond a certain mileage, it's not good to do a flush. Now that varies from transmission, because I've seen a video where a guy did it and it actually improved and he was well beyond it. One mechanic recommended him not to do it. One mechanic green lighted it with authority, and he tested and it worked fine, but that didn't work out for me in this case. So nonetheless, with that being said, if the timing cover went good and the coolant was going through appropriately, the transmission would have been the next big thing, all right, on top of other things. And environmentally, the rust as well, that's something I have to do annually. And it gets to a point where, you know, if it gets to a near bolt over subframe or any structural concerns, it's pretty much, unless you are an exceptional welder, it's a safety hazard. All right, so it was just building up against me. And there's another thing I didn't mention, is that the gas prices are bazooka right now. I ain't going to all the politics, the geopolitical things, but what I do have a confidence on is that the gas is going to get to a point where it's never going to get to again. Right, the cheapest I've ever paid for gas was $1.74. I don't think we're going to see $1.74 gas anytime soon. And as the car market goes more towards the EV route, maybe further down the line, when the mass majority of people are driving electric cars, you'll see something cheap like that because there'll be low demand. But that's another consideration as well. And with the maintenance curve, for me, financially, it started to balance out last year. Okay. And at that point, I kind of started to get a thought that, okay, the work was worth it. I'll, you know, get my return on investment. But here we are. So with all that upfront cost and just with gas and everything like that, it would be much more wiser to put that same money and potential energy into another vehicle, right, where I have more confidence in transport and traveling, right? Because when I'm traveling in this, it's, you know, you don't know what's going on. Anything can happen. And I'm at a point right now where I can't afford that unreliability. I was able to circumvent that earlier because of my flexibility, but now it's really an inconvenience to do anything to a vehicle, right? So with that all being stated, I've enjoyed the time that I've had this vehicle. A lot of the content came from this vehicle in my collection. And, you know, many of us want to drive our car as long as we can, and we're not really looking at it at the leasing and the trade-ins. We got it and we want it, we want to keep it, right? Especially the older cars, because all the technology and then some of these newer cars are failing. And if I heard this correctly, in 2027 is being mandated that these cars have to have these little cameras where they can, you know, check your biological status and see if you're sane, if you're not drunk, right, or if you're not woozy, or, you know, whatever they're trying to do. But it's not really far-fetched, because the technological interface is impeding in our lives more and more by the decade, right? So that's another incentive where people are not even really looking at the finances, they're looking at the privacy and the ownership portion of it, right? But it all ties together, man. The city you drive, the potholes, the insurance, the parts. Like for me, this car was showing up less and less in the junkyard, right? It was to a point where I had to go to another car with a similar type of engine to get the parts. You don't got parts, they're not even on back order, they're not even, you know, dated anymore, because this car is 26 years old, right? So do you have a 3D printer? Can you print certain parts and plastics, right? So it starts to get more complex. And, you know, fortunately for me, I'm in an environment now where I could, in theory, replace the transmission, right? But a lot of people don't have that, right? So you're really fighting against the wall of evolution when it comes to keeping a car of a certain age and range, right? You get lucked up, right? I was hoping that I could get lucked up and buy this car and not have any problems, right? There was a guy who told me he bought a car for $900 and he didn't really have any problems, right? So maybe 5 years of 450, 490 gas prices, unlead basis is okay for you, but again, it starts to become unreasonable at a point. So that's just the transition and transportation of life. But nonetheless, that's it. I appreciate it. Hopefully you guys learned something. Life is life, and take care.